Hi there, this is Colin Warren, and today I'm very excited to share with you an interview I had with a certain Dr. Philip Lubin. Dr. Philip Lubin is a professor of physics at UC Santa Barbra, and more importantly, he's one of the lead researchers, if not some would consider the lead researcher, for one of the projects that got me into engineering and space propulsion more in general, Project Starshot. In this interview, Dr. Lubin has talked extensively about his project, what are the ramifications of sending a 1-gram spacecraft to another solar system, this spacecraft being humanity's best option currently with using known physics for sending spacecraft objects interplanetary. I decided to delve in a little bit deeper on this topic with him in this conversation, but focusing more on the practical aspects of the actual technology. For instance, he's talked extensively about how a lot of the optical technology that enables this technology is halving in price every 2 years, much like Moore's Law. In fact, this technology is really coupled with Moore's Law, as you'll hear in our conversation. I poke him a bit to see, okay, how does that actually translate to current dollar amounts? Obviously, a little bit nuanced, get an answer from there. In addition, I get his opinion on how we get around some other problems that are really promulgate the beamed energy side of things, everything from atmospheric diffraction to some of maybe the thermal concerns, to even more fundamentally, some of the geopolitical concerns about what sort of research they've done at UC Santa Barbra about how we go about regulating this technology and making sure that we're pointing it at the objects we want to, how we get different, whether this has going to be an international effort, what international bodies we need to get together to talk, and much, much more. It was a conversation I've been really looking forward to, something, a guy whose research I've read for the last 3 years, my freshman years in college. So super excited to be saving up all of these questions from years of reading his white papers and dropping just a handful of the many I had in this limited time. So hope you guys enjoy. One thing I will mention is that because this was our first interview and he's a busy guy, we were getting lunch, I decided to record this conversation on my cell phone in the cafeteria at UC Santa Barbra. One thing you'll notice is that there is a lot of background noise. And this was a conversation I had with myself, was whether it was even worth posting this because there was so much background noise. But taking a listen and doing some post-processing and doing a couple audio checks, I concluded that it was listenable enough and the content was super interesting enough, at least for me, and I know for a few other people that are interested in this conversation, that I've decided to share it with anybody who's interested in listening. So I apologize in advance if you hear cash registers going off in the background chatter, crumpling of paper, some random beeping. This is the best we could do with the current setup. Hopefully in the future, we'll do a better job with the miking. But for now, I hope you enjoy my conversation with the one and only Dr. Philip Lubin.
Well, part of the issue that I'm sure you've seen is that there's a lot of people who dream about doing these kinds of things, which is very important that we have people to dream. Mm-hmm. But in order to accomplish those dreams, can be a very, very complex and arduous and long task in many cases. And I think that can be very, very difficult for people to understand that, your dream may come to fruition long, long after you are gone. Mm-hmm. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
And, what we're doing now will not come to fruition for the relativistic case so long after I'm dead.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother me.
Yeah. It's almost like one of those big, super mega projects you saw, that were done centuries ago, where it's done over generations through multiple, ups and downs. That, this is, a lot of society's kind of lost touch with a lot of that because, we have everything at our fingertips right away. We can do things instantaneously, and something like this.
You're exactly right. So that's some major issues that people want it done now, and they want the results done soon. Mm-hmm. They want to see what they're working on. They want their Snapchat, and their Facebook, and their Twitter, and people's attention spans are just so incredibly short.
And I'm sure that's a whole other conversation right there. I don't know if you follow like Cal Newport and stuff like that. He's basically kind of a big nonfiction author who's talked a lot about this, and he was one of the first ones to kind of talk about social media back in like 2010, he'd say, hey, it may not be the best thing for people. And then everyone kind of laughed at him because he's one of the few people who didn't have a Facebook. And he's like, I kind of just want to be, like forget which Ivy League college he's a computer science teacher at. But he's like, I'm just going to do my research. And then, 10 years later, we end up finding out Facebook not the best for, teenage girls. There's a lot of, body issues that comes with that from Instagram. And
oh, it's terrible. I think it's incredibly destructive, this whole focus on instantaneous results. Therefore, people's attention span has become incredibly short. Therefore, they're not able to focus on problems that require continuous solving rather than just quick. I want the result right now, or I'll Google it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to solve this whole problem. I know, I'll just Google the answer. Mm-hmm. And I think that is just really destructive in terms of people's creativity. And in things like what we're talking about now, this generational programs that, if you want to find a cure to cancer, it may take multiple generations, or maybe it won't happen even in 1,000 years, but we will get better and better and better at how we deal with it. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, that's how we're approaching this. This is a very scalable and modular technology. So we're funded for a NASA program to produce a solution for running a rover in a PSR, permanently shadowed region, at cryogenic temperatures. Yeah. So rather than dragging a cable around or coming back to a charging station, we'll beam power to it. And over modest distances, kilometers. Yeah. Okay. So for us, it's like, it's pretty low-hanging fruit, so to speak. But still a lot of interesting issues. And then I think those are examples where what can I do with the technology along the way to going relativistic? Yeah. Which might take 50 years to get to, or maybe even longer. Yeah. But the thing that's different here is that there are a large number of application spaces. So if you ask, what's the application space for antimatter propulsion? Can I drive my skateboard with it? Yeah. Theory, you could have the Mr. Fusion,
have the nuclear battery in your car, except an antimatter battery,
It's all, theoretically possible, but antimatter at the moment, it's the confinement, as you've said, which is the major issue. And fusion has a similar non-scalability problem, is if you want to make a fusion reactor for your laptop, it's probably not the best technology to be working on because there's certain scaling laws that disfavor miniaturization for certain technologies. Fission is another one. Making a fission reactor that fits into a AA battery is not a wise idea because of fundamental issues related to material properties, neutron cross-sections. Whereas, say, an RTG, radiothermal generator, is a conceivable application for small things, but it has all kinds of other problems. Yeah. So part of what is frustrating many times is to explain to people, what is it that we're doing, and what is the application space, and what are things which are not in application space, in our opinion. So we're doing some work right now looking at another lunar program, setting power over a point-to-point application. So in the rover application, you follow the rover and so it makes total sense. It's logical and practical. But if I wanted to send power, say, over that same distance, a kilometer from point to point fixed, no mobile, so we probably would not choose what we're doing. And then we approach it from a very practical point of view. What makes sense here and what doesn't make sense. Same thing is just true in this case, where if let's say the company they work with says, "Oh, we'd love to have the ability to receive high quality power over long distances," and yes, that would be neat to do, and yes, that can be done in theory. Yeah. It's just, are you willing to pay the price? Or are there better technologies? Yeah, I think a lot of technology, it's, a lot of it's possible, it's just isn't economically possible. And, kind of going back to our,
previous conversation about how a lot of this beam technology stuff is a lot like the transistor. There's a lot of similar analogies where, okay, yeah, I guess in theory, back in the 1960s, you could have made a gigabyte size a hard drive, but the economics weren't behind it to really incentivize that. So if you want to see some sort of outcome, you have to get the economic incentives aligned in such a way that it basically falls out of it. And kind of like the same for beam. So actually, maybe on that thread, even tying back, so we're talking about just getting a ballpark from kind of the initial prototypes that you guys have made for your beam thing. You said, okay, we did one. Correct me on the details. Like 10 centimeter aperture. I think you actually have pictures on your website that one of those setups costs about $10,000, and we talking about with the John Brophy paper. Okay, you guys did a trade space where if you did a 10 meter size array, it'd be about 10,000 elements. So if you just did rough back of the paper calculation, this doesn't take into account any sorts of economies of scale, what it looks like in the future. Roughly on the back of the envelope, $100 million, just to give people an idea. I know one other thing you've also talked about is a lot of the optics industry, a lot of this beam technology is it's tied a lot really closely to the semiconductor industry, where every 2 years the cost to generate a watt tends to get halved over time. So then that obviously plays out in the economics. So I'm curious, with the rough ballpark estimation that we made $100 million, is it correct to say then past performance isn't necessarily predictive of future performance? But let's say if you made this technology, if you did, maybe let's go back. If you took your technology you have right now, let's say $100 million, 2 years ago, would it cost you guys roughly $200 million to make? And if so, I guess what are the particular components that are halving every 2 years that allow you guys to, continue to reduce the costs?
Right. So some technologies scale exponentially.
Yep.
Or have been scaling exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
They're well approximated by exponential scaling, and others do not. So if you look around where we're sitting here, the concrete and the wood and the carpet,
mm-hmm.
the chairs, the table, those don't scale exponentially at all.
Yeah.
Those are about the same price in constant dollars
mm-hmm.
as they were 50 years ago.
Yep.
And they'll probably be similar 100 years from now. So those are kind of flat technology.
Yeah.
If you look at rocket costs, so the cost to make a rocket, really the only reason that one of the reasons that the cost per kilogram into orbit are coming down is a combination of people who've learned to make things more cheaply, but that's only a bit of it. Mm-hmm. The real change has become the ability to launch more mass, so there's an economy of scale.
Yep.
And the fact that there's competition, and the fact that there's a need to do so, mm-hmm. to put mass into orbit economically. When it was purely driven by national interests, there was less of a concern about the cost than
mm-hmm.
there was capability.
Yeah.
With the onset of companies like SpaceX saying, hey, we can reduce the cost by reusing our components, and therefore you're to some extent paying for fuel rather than for metal
mm-hmm.
toward it. So that then does dramatically have the capability to change the cost of orbit. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't call it an exponential technology at all. I would say that rocket engines are relatively flat technology.
Yeah.
If you trace all of the rocket engines currently used in the liquid area, they're all essentially copies of the V2. Mm-hmm. Just with slight tweaks here and there. The fuels, instead of being oxygen, alcohol as it was in 1943, it's now oxygen and kerosene, oxygen and methane, oxygen and hydrogen. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, and there are some other liquid fuel combinations, but in general, there's no significant change.
Yeah.
In fundamentals, there's a change in size. Mm-hmm. And so we're not doing anything particularly new in the last 80 years in terms of getting off the surface of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And unlikely that that's going to scale in any exponential way, with the exception of being that we can reuse components so we can get off the surface more cheaply. So that's a great thing.
Yeah.
I'm very supportive of that. But if you ask, well, okay, now instead of going, say, 10 kilometers per second orbital plus a little more, or if I want a positive C3, I want to escape the Earth's gravity. How do I do so? Well, it's we live on a planet where it's just barely possible to escape the Earth's gravity with chemistry.
Yeah.
I mean, just barely. It really just barely works. And I'm sure you've heard this before. If the Earth were twice as large, chemistry basically wouldn't get us off the planet. It just wouldn't be functional.
Yeah.
But if you say, well, I'd like to go 10 times faster, I want to go to 100 kilometers per second. Can I just build a bigger rocket? And it doesn't work because there's a logarithmic term that you have to deal with, and therefore the approach to high speeds is extraordinarily painful. So then you have to turn to other technologies, whether it's ion engines or even nuclear. Something like nuclear thermal, people tend to think, well, that's going to solve all kinds of problems. It gets 10 times faster. Well, it doesn't. You can maybe get to twice as big as about twice the ISP.
Yeah.
But you know all this. So the question you're asking is, what is changing exponentially in the directed energy arena? And not everything is. So if you look at things like the cost of glass for building optics, is the cost of glass exponentially dropping? No. Is the cost of a lens exponentially dropping? Not in general. But there are ways of making optical elements that are very different than the traditional way of grinding glass. You can use thin film technologies, so that has the ability to radically drop the cost. It's still not what I would call an exponential technology. So I would say things like reusing rocket engines or step technologies. So you're going along, it's pretty flat, and then someone figures, I can reuse the rocket, so maybe I can drop the cost by a factor 10. But can I keep dropping a factor 10 every 2 years? No. You can't. Because then you hit a bottom which is limited by fuel costs. Okay, so that's not an exponential technology. It's a step technology versus a flat technology. In say optics, can I reduce the cost of the optics by going from ground glass to thin film technologies? Yes. Is that exponential? Depends on how you look at it. I see it more as a step technology that could drop the cost maybe by 3 to 4 orders of magnitude, and then it'll probably flatline there.
Still, 3 to 4 orders of magnitude. That's huge.
Yeah. Then it doesn't become a dominant cost; it becomes a subdominant cost. So you don't have to have everything be exponential. Right? The cost of your car doesn't have to be a penny in today's dollars to be useful. It'd be nice if your car cost was, say, under $10,000 for an electric car that's like a Tesla. Then it would be good enough. It doesn't have to be a penny. So there are certain parts which are exponential in costs. Your cell phone doesn't really cost exponentially less each time you go in. It's just there's exponentially more capability to your cell phone. More transistors, more memory, more pixels in your phone. So that's an example of a technology which is both flat in cost, namely the cost of your phone, and then the cost per, say, transistor, which has been going down exponentially. So for us, the components which are scaling exponentially are things like semiconductor diodes to pump our amplifiers, our optical amplifiers.
Gotcha, okay.
Okay, so those have been scaling approximately exponentially. And then at some point you hit a bottom, which would be the cost of materials. The cost of mining or refining the various types of semiconductors which are used. Whereas most of the costs currently, if you ask, of a bill of materials of what's inside our units, what's the bottom line in terms of the cost of all the metal, the cost of all the semiconductor material as material. So a true bill of materials. So I went through this analysis years ago, looked at things like, so how much does it cost per kilogram of ytterbium? Mined. Okay, so that's, and in our system it would be pennies or something like that for the real cost of ytterbium. Or what's the cost of the semiconductor material we use for pump diodes for the material, not for the production of the unit. and all the material costs are essentially irrelevant. So we're not limited by some precious metals or some sort of unusually expensive things. What we're limited by is the ability to fabricate and produce things. So that puts you in a good position to say, well, can't I lower those costs dramatically by mass production, by
oh, gotcha. Okay.
by processing techniques similar to what's in your computer. So if you ask, what's the cost of the silicon in your phone? And the answer is, it's irrelevant.
Yeah.
It's just totally irrelevant. Then it becomes a question of processing of the silicon into processors and diodes to light up your screen, laser diodes, LEDs, etc. It's really LEDs in this case.
Yeah.
So that's a good way to look at a system. What's the fundamental cost of materials that go into a rocket that leaves the Earth? So there's fuel, there's metal, and there's processing of the metal into valves and pumps and things like that. But if you ask, okay, just weigh everything and tell me how much does it cost per pound of stainless steel, how much does it cost per pound of titanium, how much does it cost per pound of liquid oxygen, and you'd find, man, there's somebody's like threw in an extra,
Yeah. So
cost.
if I understand you correctly, it's more the technologies that process the raw materials that is getting cheaper because now we can run, let's say, a lathe twice as fast, so that does it. Let's say reduces our cost in half and stuff like that. So it sounds like, in particular for you guys, optics is the part of it. My optics isn't as strong as as I wish it would. The amplifier in this case is that's one of the big areas is that the processing technology is that's the kind of one of the areas that's exponentially getting better because we're figuring out better ways of making these amplifiers so that, I don't know, 2 years ago, if you would have made this system, these amplifiers would have been, let's say, roughly twice as much, but now we've gotten twice as good at making them, so you'd take it right. Okay, that gives a good sense. So as amplifiers, that's the biggest one. Are there any other small ones that's kind of like the 80-20?
No, there's so the optical amplifiers consist of, in our case, we're doing fiber-based amplifiers, which there are other paths forward, which we explored, pure semiconductor amplifiers, which are very promising and may yet be the way to go. So we're only looking at what baselines will allow us to move forward, even if they're not the ultimate solution to what is made 50 years ago. I think it would be incredible hubris to say that, well, all they have to do is make exactly what we have here and just make more of them and you're done. To me, that's not a logical answer at all, because over long time periods, we know that technology changes quite dramatically in areas like this. Concrete, no. Steel, no. But in the semiconductor, photonics, yes. Radical.
Gotcha. Okay.
So our amplifiers, if you want to think of it in a simplistic way, are glass doped with special materials that allow them to amplify or kind of laze. Technically speaking, they're laser amplifiers rather than lasers, but subtle distinction. And then you have to pump that into an inverted state to get amplification. So you pump it with a semiconductor laser, which in our case is a semiconductor laser diode. And those devices are getting progressively cheaper, exponentially, kind of, but you will hit this bottom line. You'll get so cheap eventually that you're limited by materials costs.
Yeah.
And you see that, for example, if we look above, so we have some LED lights, and if you look at the cost of LED lighting, it's largely dominated now by the cost of the packaging and electronics that go into it, rather than the semiconductor. In this, most LED lighting uses gallium nitride and then a phosphor to convert the bluish light into a more pleasing white light. And so the actual cost of the production of the LEDs is no longer dominated by the semiconductor costs. And the same is true in photovoltaics, the solar panels you put on your roof. It used to be, not too long ago, that the cost of solar power solar electric was dominated by the cost of not the silicon itself, but the refining of the silicon, the doping, and the processing of silicon. Now the cost is dominated by the glass, the metal, the wiring, and most critically, the person that installs it, and the inverters and everything else. So the actual semiconductor costs are a small fraction of the cost now. So there's an example where you hit a bottom where you can't keep exponentially decreasing the cost.
Yeah.
Right, it's already dropped by more than 3 orders of magnitude in cost in the last, probably say, 30-ish years or so. And compared to, say, 50, 60, well, see, the first really decent silicon PV was in the 1950s out of Bell Labs. So that was about almost 70 years ago. And since then it's dropped by probably 4 orders of magnitude or something like that.
Yeah.
I have to go back and look at the real numbers and inflate them into today's dollars.
Yeah.
So there's a technology which it's gone about as far as it's going to go in terms of exponential. Now it's kind of a slow slog.
Yeah.
It hit roughly 30 cents a watt in production quantities, and it'll sit there for a while. And then it even went up for a bit. So now it's driven by market forces, not just production costs.
Yeah.
In our case, if we could get the cost of our system down per watt to the same thing you have in an LED, in terms of production. So if you look at the bulbs above, those are roughly 10 watt in terms of optical power output devices. They're about 50% efficient, so they draw about 20 watts of electrical power, produce 10 watts of optical power, and the cost per watt quantity one of those bulbs at the consumer level, say what you pay in the store, you pay about, for a typical light bulb that replaces a 100-watt bulb, it's between, say, on sale you might get it for $5 and maybe $10 depending on how fancy you want to get it. But it's of order less than $1 per watt of optical output, and that's quantity one at the consumer. That's what you pay.
Yeah.
If you ask what does it cost to make it, it's way below that.
Yeah.
You're kind of at the order 10 cents a watt-ish level. So if we could be at that point, say 10 cents a watt, then we would be at a level where you would say, okay, this not only makes total sense, but we'll just go ahead and do it.
And I think, correct me, I guess I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it was, when I last checked, I think it was like $12 a watt. It was the kind of the scale, and there's a sense in that, I guess between yourself and the industry, that I guess it's going to keep dropping at this rate. Obviously, past performance is not an indicator of future performance, but that there's still room to grow given that, I think it's like $12 right now per watt. If my number was right, I could be wrong. Feel free to correct me there.
So at the pump hour level, the production cost is around $1 to $2 per watt at production.
Okay.
That's the production side, not the cost to me.
Yeah.
All right, but the production side. Then you have to package it, test it, everything. Then you get up to, depending on the device you're buying, you're probably at 10 or tens of dollars per watt. But there are other types of laser diodes used in consumer electronics, which are showing up increasingly. Laser lighting, for example, is about to hit. So instead of LED lighting, you'll have laser lighting, and that will produce lasers that are incredibly low cost because they have to compete with LEDs. So if you don't get down to 10 cents per watt at production level, you don't have a product to sell.
Yeah.
Okay. It doesn't really matter. They're already 50% efficient. So you could get maybe 70% efficiency if you push really hard, which would be very helpful. But you can't go another factor 2 in efficiency. Right? You're already at about 50%. So you do factor 2, you're at 100%. It's perfect. So that's not going to change dramatically over the next decade.
Yeah.
Some improvement, but it won't be dramatic. The cost is already at the point where I can imagine a bulb could come down to maybe $1 or something like that. Below that, I don't think so. There's just not a driver to drive it to a penny a bulb.
Yeah.
there's a point at which the packaging, like the ability to put it on the shelf and the package it and stuff, it just doesn't make sense. So if you look at the history of lots of technologies, like even incandescent light bulbs are a good example. Incandescent light bulbs were very expensive at the beginning, and then in today's dollars. And then they came down so that people didn't even really think about it. It's 25 cents a bulb or something.
Yeah.
So there are parts of our system where we have paths forward that we've already mapped out. Okay, this thing costs me $1,000 right now. I know how to get it down to $1.
Yeah.
Okay, I just have to work on that. Some parts, like the pump diodes, unless we're going to go into the manufacturing business ourselves, I'm going to have to wait for other market forces to reduce the cost. And what are those market forces? There are things like laser lighting, lasers used in industrial processing, lasers used for communication systems. Lasers, for example, a good example is a DVD writer or a Blu-ray writer. Those are actually, at the wattage level, they're lasers, not laser amplifiers.
Yeah.
But they're pushing a reasonable fraction of a watt, and they're pennies or 10 cents or something like that in the production level. They're really, really cheap.
Gotcha.
Because they had to be. So they figured out how to make them really cheap. And it's amazing when people have to make a lot of something, they figure out ways to make it cheap. So we're kind of the recipient of that. And I'm not saying different to you than I said 10 years ago. It's all this, look at the market forces that drive these things forward. What is inside the box that's so expensive? Why is it so expensive? Why can't we do it now?
Yeah.
And you come down to the realization there's nothing in the box that should be expensive. There's just not a large market to force the price down. And what will be the market force the price down? So on the laser pump diode side, there are forces at play which have nothing to do with interstellar or relativistic flight or anything in propulsion. It's just the consumer wants cheaper light bulbs that are more efficient, so laser lighting will come out soon. And we'll probably get down. I mean, they're already around a buck a watt in $1 to $2 a watt in production. Not what you buy, but in production. Can I see it hitting 10 cents a watt? Yeah. That's already what your LED is at the production level. And there's nothing intrinsically different between a gallium nitride LED, which is already pretty sophisticated, and a laser semiconductor. It's just there's a huge market for that bulb, and there's not a huge market for that laser diode.
Gotcha.
Pump. The good news is there are market forces which will push the prices down. And if you look at every part of our system, we more or less have identified paths forward that either there are market forces that can push it down, or we will have to take control and drive the price down ourselves.
Gotcha. Do you know, because this might be something that either you've done it informally in talks, or maybe it was a white paper I haven't, at least I somehow missed. Do you know if there was a paper where you guys actually go, I guess you kind of publicly talk about what of the items are going to see? It sounds like in the case of some of the LEDs, they have maybe at least an order of magnitude, if not more so, that they can reduce. Or is it more just been kind of internal analysis from you guys that you just kind of eyeballing it, seeing what consumer electronics are for different chemistries?
So in the original roadmap, there's a plot of the cost versus time for laser amplifiers.
Okay.
And you'll see a nice fit to an exponential about 18-month time to 1 hour.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So that we published. There's some other work. We just published a paper called The Economics of Interstellar Flight, which goes through. It's more of a mathematical analysis of the economics rather than a technical cost projection of what's coming down the road. But we do have some discussion there on the comparison to LED lighting and solar, say, photovoltaics. And in a sense, the simplest way to ask this is, how low do you need to go, and can you point to anything that is of similar or comparable complexity that has a cost point that you'd be happy with? And I think the best thing I can point to is your LED light bulb, and say those used to be incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
And now they're incredibly cheap.
Gotcha.
Why? A, people figured out how to make materials that were appropriate, so gallium nitride came along. And B, they realized there was a huge market out there. And if they could just make it cheap enough, they could make billions of dollars in profit, because people wanted efficient lighting. And hence this was formed. Just like in your computer, the cost of a teraflop in 1960 was probably larger than the world GDP. Whereas the cost of a teraflop today is you go out and buy a GPU for $500. And you've got 10 teraflops. And so that's in today's dollar. And so there are these, we haven't identified anything specific that doesn't have a path forward to radical cost reduction. But it's not worth our while right now to invent that industry that will do that. We've already looked at it, said, yeah, we could do that, but we have other things we need to do first.
And it seems like there's other industries already driving a lot of the components that you guys are interested in, so you just let them run their thing. That makes sense.
Where some of the parts we said, I don't see the natural industry yet, that might yet emerge for driving this down, so if we have to take control of it, we kind of know what to do.
Gotcha.
We can go in the clean room and make these things en masse if we have to. But right now, our time is better spent looking at some of the critical technical paths, phasing over large baselines, noise characteristics of amplifiers, beacon locking, fundamental phase convergence algorithms. That's where we feel our time is best spent. We do have a sort of an economics development program going on in parallel, which is looking at specific parts where we're going to be making some runs of trying to radically reduce the cost of some of the optical elements.
Gotcha. Okay.
To see, we already have the designs for it, and we're going to start a phase of doing some prototyping and see if it works. It should work based on all our designs and knowledge of how to build things. But we're not going to do that for every part. Our time is better spent doing these other things. But when you come down and you say, what is in the box that is expensive fundamentally? Nothing. There's nothing in it that's fundamentally expensive.
In fact, they still have a lot more room to grow, especially if you extrapolate from seeing how LEDs tracked, over a few decades, how much those reduced. There should be a similar thing here, because there are other economic forces that are pushing other industries to make it cheaper. If I guess to summarize that kind of.
The difference is that LED lighting is ubiquitous, so
versus this
everybody.
This is
how
much
many
more
people
niche.
want to build.
High power.
And so the best we can do is look at those things which will impact our costing, and those things which won't. So there is some concrete and steel, in building things. And we know that that's not an exponential technology. So there'll be some baseline cost of leveling land if you're going to do it on the Earth. Building concrete piers and telescope mounts and tracking mounts and so on. So there's a little bit of discussion of that in our papers, but we have had a number of people, including some of our current supporters, ask us how much is it going to cost to do this.
And it's like, well, it's all,
And then to some extent, the answer is if you have to ask, you probably should put your money elsewhere.
Because we're going to need maybe a decade or two or longer than you're probably interested in order to.
And that's a serious problem, is that a lot of people are like, okay, I'll invest this much money, but I'd really like it to be done soon enough so I can see it launch.
That makes sense. Actually, maybe, I guess, tying to the technical part area, and then I guess delving in something you talked about it a bit, kind of with this laser system with kind of your atmosphere problem. I know one thing, looking at some of the papers, is one of the reasons why directed energy weapons, why those have been a little bit harder, is because you have to deal with the atmospheric perturbations. Sort of, our use case is a little bit nicer because you can keep your area fixed. You can still, if you want to do an Earth-based one, keep it there, shine it up. One at least area of the trade space I've heard you guys explore a bit, and I'm curious to see, I guess, what you guys have looked at is in terms of dealing with a lot of the atmosphere. One thing you brought up is like, well, you can go, you place your, basically your array at 5,000 kilometers or higher. Like let's say my apologies. Yeah, so 5 kilometers or higher. Somewhere like some of those mountains in Chile, you get basically 100% transmission versus, at least in some of the numbers I looked at, on when you're at sea level, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong because maybe I'm looking at the wrong places, it's more like 50 or 60% because a lot of the ytterbium wavelengths are being absorbed by water molecules. Is that, I don't know if that's correct or not, or at least, feel free to, I guess, kind of fill in that intuition.
The problem with the atmosphere is it is extremely complex. So today is relatively clear outside.
Yeah.
And so if you looked at the transmission from sea level on a clear day, it's not so bad. You can at a micron, it's probably like 80% or so transmission on a clear day going vertical.
And is that from sea level?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you say, okay, well, if I go to, we run a high altitude site up in the White Mountains area.
Yeah.
It's at 4 kilometers, and so there it could be around 90 to 95%. But it's very dependent on the water vapor component. What's called precipitable water vapor in the atmosphere. It depends on aerosol contents, dust contents. But it can be pretty good. You would say, well, 80% is good enough for me.
Yeah.
But the problem is, it's not just transmission; it's the perturbations in the atmosphere. How much is the index refraction varying along the line of sight? So this gets into the whole area of adaptive optics and atmospheric perturbations, changes.
Yeah.
And it's quite a nasty area, frankly. And it is one of the reasons why, when you look at directed energy weapon systems, that they've had so much trouble in deploying them.
Because of that, because of the varying diffraction. Gotcha.
I wrote a letter to a colleague recently, and I said, if we could just get the enemy to cooperate with us, only attack on clear days that have low CN squared, good atmospheric conditions, then we can get better shape. Can't we just agree to that?
Because when you say adaptive optics, and cosmology is your bread and butter, so you're going to know way more about this here. But I remember that there's whole arrays of, I think it's the ALMA array, but I know there's a lot of telescopes that already use adaptive optics to correct a lot of perturbations. Maybe, I don't know if that's because they're also on top of a mountain, so then that means a lot of their, I guess, a lot of the noise that they correct for is a lot lower. But I'm not, I guess, for a group that was interested in building, like you guys, I guess, how hard of a problem, you build, let's say someone came along, they give you $100 million or $1 billion, you guys build it. How hard of a problem is the adaptive optics side of things versus, a lot of the other technical problems? Is that kind of your top challenge? Because I know you talked about, some of the phasing, that's another one. Where's it kind of stack up and relative to those other technical challenges you guys have?
Right. So the way I'd answer that is that the ability to mitigate the atmosphere to the point where you're not prevented from accomplishing whatever mission you have, whatever that might be, that the atmosphere can just completely shut you down. So let's say it's raining today.
Yeah.
Am I going to launch? No. Because the atmosphere conditions are horrible, and we're not going to get my beam through the atmosphere. So if there's a war today and it's raining, I'm not going to use my directed energy weapon system.
Yeah.
Okay. But if it's raining today, I'll just say, I'll wait for it to be clear before I launch. The same way you do with a chemical rocket. I'll wait till the storm passes. Because you have what's called a cooperative target in that case, i.e. you want to launch, you wait till the weather gets good, then you launch.
Yeah.
So the same is true for us. However, there's another solution for us, which in the long term is a preferable one, which is why be on the Earth at all for this system? Why not go on to the moon or orbit? And you kind of, we look like way ahead. We're looking, suppose you're 100 years out, and you say, if this technology works the way it looks like it's going to work, then you really want to look way ahead and say, want to get human missions, if humans still are in the picture, want to get people back forth to Mars, maybe I should start thinking about, how would I accomplish that on relatively short timescales. And there, going outside the Earth's atmosphere becomes a really important part of it. So there's a solution to the Earth's atmosphere.
Well, if you get out of it, because I also know, at least Yuri Milner, when or maybe it was somebody else, but someone was a big proponent of doing the initial testing, on Earth first, because that's going to be okay, great, everything's fine and dandy. If the atmosphere you don't have to worry about, but something breaks up in space, the robotic servicing aspect of that becomes a little bit more difficult.
Well, not just a little.
Yeah, like we have it.
It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So for practical reasons, you don't want to start in space. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, but that's why I was just kind of curious from when you guys have been doing some of your, because you're doing a lot of Earth, a lot of Earth testing, where the challenge of the adaptive optical stuff versus stuff like your phasing, because you guys have gotten way better results than you were expecting, for that. So I guess I was just curious, kind of how that was stacking up, at least on the Earth-based stuff.
Yeah. So the ability to mitigate the Earth's atmosphere, which is what we would often call adaptive optics.
Yeah.
Is A, good in the sense that we can wait for good days. B, we can go to high altitudes where the atmosphere is typically, not always, but typically much better in the sense that the perturbations are less. And that's a very quantitative statement that we make in our papers.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? And we explain what that means in our papers. And what we've done is modeled the atmosphere and simulated what the atmosphere does to our beam and our feedback loops, and shown, at least analytically it works, numerically it works, and then in the laboratory we inject an atmospheric perturbation spectrum, which is quite reasonable, into a optical system where we can actually perturb the beam, and then we see if we can take it out. So we built a demonstration system, and that worked.
Gotcha. And now, actually go for it.
But still, I'd rather not have an atmosphere.
Yeah.
Because it actually complicates things at a variety of levels. And one of the serious levels is it pushes us towards higher and higher loop rates, so that the phasing becomes much more difficult. We have to do it much more rapidly than we would if we were in space. So our at least my goal, is to prove that it basically works, and to do as well as we can with the atmosphere. And it appears from our analytical calculations, our numerical simulations, and our laboratory simulations that we can deal with the Earth's atmosphere on good days.
Yeah.
Not on rainy days, on good days.
Yeah.
And we've done testing outside. To some extent, we haven't done the full-blown tests that we really want to do, but we're working towards that.
Yeah.
But I don't, if people are still doing this from the Earth 100 years from now, I was wondering, what went wrong?
Yeah.
Maybe you guys figured out how to deal with the Earth's atmosphere much better than I could.
Yeah.
Or maybe for your application space, it wasn't a big deal. So for example, sending Earth to Leo.
Yeah.
Well, if you're going to do Earth to Leo, going into space and do Leo to Leo doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But doing Earth to Leo, So you want to be on the Earth to send to Leo because there are lots of applications where you need to do that. And Earth to Geo, for the kind of stuff that you're interested in.
Yeah.
So that makes complete sense. On the other hand, the requirements there are not nearly as severe as they are for the kind of work we want to do on these, really exotic, ultra high performance missions where we want to shoot something out at 4,000 Gs and get up to 30% speed of light in minutes, then you have to have a very, very different approach. If I just want to send power to a spacecraft, I don't really care so much if the beam is bouncing around the spacecraft. There are ways to deal with that electronically on the spacecraft end to average out the power.
Yeah.
Okay. On the other hand, if I'm sending it to propel something, then it causes severe problems.
Yeah.
So again, it depends on what is it you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Which there is no one answer to some of these questions because the answer will be it depends.
Yep. Yeah.
Tell me what your application is, and then I can address it.
Yeah.
And that's another part of the problem here is that people tend to think of this in a stereotypical way of, oh, these guys, want to propel small wafer scale spacecraft, observatory. This is just part of a transformational technology, of which that is one application space.
Yeah.
It was by far not application space at all.
Yeah, anywhere you need power, there could be an application for this, and I wonder what sort of things you need power for.
Like who would ever want power in space?
Yeah, I know. It's sense. Like, how do satellites work again? I know. Whatever. Maybe looking at the time, I think we'll keep it to maybe see how this last question goes. Either do this, maybe one more bonus one. I'm curious. So, we talked about how much it costs, atmospheric perturbations. I'm curious, and I think we briefly mentioned this on the phone. I think like you to expand on a bit. Kind of the problem of how accurate when you're trying to point a beam at a target. How do you have to worry about other things getting hit? In the process, like I'm familiar with like if you're familiar with the area diffraction limit or the disk, you'll have those side lobes that can do all sorts of weird things unless you have, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's like a lambda/2 spacing between your optical elements, and then you don't get the radial lobes. Yeah, the radial lobes. So I'm wondering how you guys, if you're looking at you're beaming off and you have kind of those radial lobes, how you guys have thought about kind of getting that whole problem of making sure that you're pointing the beam where you want to point it, because I'm sure there's some geopolitical concerns if you point at things that you don't want to point it at.
So we actually wrote a paper about that. It's on the archive. It's on our website. Look it up.
Yeah. Do you remember what it was called again?
I don't. It's on our website.
I might ping you for it afterwards.
Well, it's actually literally on our Starlight area. You'll find almost all our papers.
Yeah.
I forget how we worded it. It was something like directed energy satellite interdiction or intercepts or something like that. We published it a couple of years ago.
Gotcha.
And what we did was we modeled the orbital elements of essentially all unclassified assets.
Yeah.
And then looked at various mission scenarios and looked at how often we'd intercept a spacecraft.
Yeah.
Assuming that you didn't know where they were, which of course is silly because you do know where they were.
Yeah.
And so the obvious answer is, well, if you know where they are, just turn off your beam when they go through your beam.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a solution to the problem, which is that. Now, for some systems, that's not a problem. For other systems, turning it off too much is problematic because then you can disrupt your propulsion.
Yeah.
So we looked at, how often does it happen? How much time you have between intercepts? And the bottom line answer was at the time, which was several years ago, which unfortunately the number of satellites is increasing rapidly.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
It wasn't really much of an issue if you didn't do anything. It was about, about 10 minus 3 of the time would you hit something. Now, because we don't converge our beam until we are intercepting our target, and the satellites are not our targets. Could be.
Gotcha.
They're not.
Yeah.
So it's like in a microscope. If you look at the beam profile, if I'm looking at something, little speck down here, the beam is expanding like that. And if this were transmitting light, and the flux down here, the amount of watts per square meter would be very high, but by the time you get way up here, it's really small. So our beam is like the opposite of that. We're converging with an array onto a target. This spacecraft is
so the
here,
actual,
the flux here is low.
Gotcha. Okay, but you still, my intuition is that even if there are spacecraft that haven't planned for that low flux, and I guess that might be a conversation you have to have.
It's partly a political conversation. Is that by convention, you are not supposed to shine a laser in the sky at really anything above a certain level.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is it's worded quite ambiguously. So does that mean I can't take a laser pointer and point up the sky? And actually, there's some consumer level, quote consumer level lasers that you can get arrested for shining up in the sky if they hit an aircraft.
Yeah.
That's a crime. Mm-hmm. But people go out and buy, 1 watt laser pointers and to use them to point things up, look at Orion, for example. It's a great pointer for star parties. Mm-hmm. And you can buy them on Amazon and on eBay. So, why are they not outlawed? It partly kind of sneaks under the radar. People don't worry as much about it, but you can actually get arrested for doing that. So the question you bring up is actually a pretty serious one from an operational point of view, because there is a control system for this, which is it's called a laser clearinghouse, which is a DoD entity which actually controls the use of lasers both from the ground, mostly from the ground to space is what they're worried about.
Yeah.
And it's not so much that you're going to blow a hole through a spacecraft, which you could, but it's that, you might blind a sensor that they have, a saturated sensor they have on board, and they don't like that. And so by agreement, people have, and partly there's some laws too, that people have agreed that they will notify the relevant authorities when they're going to send a beam.
Yeah.
Now, there's this ambiguity. A light show has lasers.
Yeah.
How do light shows deal with it? And to some extent, they also notify the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, which is not the laser clearinghouse. And they also are restricted in flux at, basically, a typical LEO asset is at least 300 kilometers off the surface of the Earth. Okay, so if you look at the flux on the target, there should be these quantitative numbers, but people worry that others won't interpret them properly. So in general, the rule is you're going to shine anything up in the sky which is a laser, you really should think carefully about it, because you could get in trouble. And people have gotten in trouble for taking laser pointers and pointing at aircraft, for example.
Oh yeah,
You can get arrested for that.
Yeah.
On the military side, they would like everybody to clear it through them, but that's not going to happen with civilians taking laser pointers and pointing out in the sky. It's more of an FAA issue. For us, it would be a huge issue. We said, I'm going to broadcast 100 gigawatts for 5 minutes to propel a probe out.
Yeah.
There'll have to be an international agreement and discussion on that. In terms of the flux on target, the beam is diffuse enough that in general you're not vaporizing any spacecraft, except maybe wrong. And it's more a question of if you are illuminating an adversary of the United States satellite, they might get pissed at you, just as we would with them.
Yeah.
So everyone tries to play nice in there, but it is an area of regulatory concern. It has to be addressed, but at this point we just say that's somebody else's problem.
Yeah, we're engineers. This is it's
somebody else's problem. We did publish a paper that looks in depth at this problem in certain scenarios and point out, where the spacecraft are. You just turn your beam off and it goes through, and it passes fairly quickly through. You can turn it back on again.
Yeah.
This is a deterministic problem. But the flip side of that is your same system could be used to focus on the satellite.
Yeah.
So there's going to have to be some regulatory.
Yeah, that's
major regulatory issues. If we built it our adversaries are going to not believe us that it's for fundamental science. And if they build it, we definitely wouldn't believe that.
Yeah, interesting game theory problem right there. Yeah. Well, cool. So I'll take a quick glance through here, but I think those are kind of all the major questions. Maybe one small one. Somebody was bringing up to me when you're looking at, megawatts or gigawatts of a beaming station on Earth, you kind of have a thermal problem. We have to dissipate, if you had, let's say, 50% beam efficiency, 50% is going to the laser, and the other 50% has to go somewhere else. How have you guys found the thermal problem to be an interesting challenge for your initial prototypes?
It's not. Let me give you an analogy because I think it'll help think about things. So we walked, from the physics department over here, walked less than a kilometer, but let's call it a kilometer just to make it simple. So if you say, well, how much sunlight is hitting the square kilometer, and is that a problem? So it's about 1,000 watts per square meter at the surface area. Kilometers 1,000 meters. Kilometer squared is 1,000,000 square meters. 1,000,000 square meters times a kilowatt per square meter is 1 billion. It's a gigawatt in this 1 square kilometer.
Yeah.
Right. I don't see the trees, vaporizing.
Yeah, gotcha.
And the thermal management's pretty simple. So if you were to go, say the size of the local city here, which is Goleta, it's maybe 10 kilometers, 6 miles on a side, pretty small.
Yeah.
So that's 100 square kilometers. Okay, so now my 1 gigawatt goes to 100 gigawatts. So there's 100 gigawatts of sunlight falling right now on the local city. Is there any major thermal measure?
I think I was more asking, so for your actual systems generating it, like usually I know some of them will run cooling water through it. I wonder if you guys are running into...
Yeah, so the amount of power that you're dissipating per unit area is really the most
so that's the way to think about it.
Yeah,
okay.
So if you think about sunlight, which is 1,000 watts a square meter, which in some of our designs, 1,000 watts per square meter is about the amount of power that we would generate for large arrays.
Okay, gotcha.
In other arrays, it may be 10 kilowatts a square meter. In some arrays, it's 100 kilowatts a square meter.
Yeah.
At 100 kilowatts a square meter, you do have some serious concerns about your tree.
Yeah, but that's actually good. So you're saying for kilometer, we have about
a gigawatt.
Gigawatt, and trees aren't running active cooling. Last I checked, maybe a biologist will come in and say something different, but I don't know if it's.
They have their own active cooling of respiration.
Yeah, even then.
So it's. The numbers, they are big numbers, but when you have big area,
to dissipate.
Large area, the big numbers turn into relatively modest fluxes.
Gotcha.
It's not that it's the non-problem. We have some issues that we're looking at are things like thermal blooming in the atmosphere. Because the atmosphere absorbs a little bit of power.
Gotcha.
So as you send light up through the atmosphere, the atmosphere will heat slightly, just as the sun heats the Earth's atmosphere.
Yeah.
So again, you're this kind of similar. Well, am I destroying the atmosphere by having sunlight on the atmosphere? Mm-hmm. No, but am I influencing? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's why we have warm days, cool days.
Yeah.
There's different. The sun influences our environment dramatically, but there is an interesting problem that we've run. It's also in some of our papers in this book, which is looking at. It's called thermal blooming, as you imagine transmitting power through the atmosphere, heating the atmosphere slightly, so you're going to create a convective zone.
Oh, wow!
It's going to, it's going to heat it slightly. It's not a whole. It's not a lot. But assuming that you have a low flux, but you do have a little bit of heating, and then the air tends to rise, and you get convective cells, you get perturbations, and so it's a bit unclear because no one's actually ever had this level of large aperture with modest flux. It's not high flux. For example, tactical systems have much higher flux than we do. Flux in watts per square meter, even at the aperture. And in general, it's not a serious problem for them. Atmospheric perturbations in general are a serious problem. But in terms of them modifying the atmosphere, it's in general not a serious problem. Now, if you make the V much smaller, then it can become a serious problem. So if you take the same amount of power coming out of a typical tactical system, which is over 100 kilowatts, and you were to focus it down onto the target, then heating of the local air can perturb the beam itself.
Gotcha.
It can be a self-influencing problem. You can actually have focusing effects. You can actually have self-focusing for heated air. So it can be a good thing, but it can also be bad.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes, okay, so it's a tractable problem then, but just,
It appears to be tractable. We've run a bunch of calculations.
Yeah.
It looks okay, but again, long run, thermal blooming, no atmosphere, no thermal blooming.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, well, I think everybody would agree, if we can take everything up to space, everything gets a lot more interesting.
Yeah, it also makes the system a lot simpler in some ways in terms of loop closure times become a lot slower. You don't have to deal with perturbations, so you can take your time in adjusting the phase.
Yeah.
And it's just, if someone asked me, would you rather do this on the surface of the Earth or on the surface of the moon? It's like, well, what's my lab on the moon compared to my lab on the Earth?
Yeah, it's another one of those, let's see in 100 years,
Well, it's like,
yeah.
But if it works on the Earth, it's going to work killer.
Oh yeah, easy. Yeah, I think there's
way easier.
I think it's the cost per kilogram of getting it to space that seems to be the main problem there, and that's where you have the economic play. Where technically, it's a little bit hard with the atmospheric, but now you have to fight against the economics of getting your beam, all your energy sources elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly right. Because it's so expensive to put something in space. And anyway, you wouldn't want to do that until you determine that it works well enough to justify it.
Yeah, it makes sense.
For both reasons. A, we want a prototype where we can go out and kick it.
Yep.
And rapidly iterate.
Yeah.
And B, you could do some testing like, a big, take a big tube, like a LIGO kind of tube, evacuate it.
And to see what does it do in the vacuum.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we know how to build big vacuum systems, not 100-kilometer kind of vacuum systems, but kilometer class vacuum systems are already built.
Yeah. But some super colliders, I'm sure, will have something to say there. And all that.
They're already. NASA has a 500-meter class large bore vacuum system for testing some things, and LIGO's 4 kilometers. And some people know how to do some of that. No one has a 10-kilometer diameter.
Yeah, that would be quite the building a 10-kilometer anything is already pretty impressive enough, and now we're gonna make even on I was talking to another friend about why the whole Hyperloop thing, why I didn't go off, because intuitively think, well, if you have no air resistance, in theory, you kick your engine and it just moves forever. But then someone brought up a good point that building a vacuum system that long, it's going to be quite an interesting challenge. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I think they will accomplish that. The diameter doesn't have to be that big. Like if you have maybe a 2-3 meter diameter tube, you can get people inside. If you look at an aircraft, the interior diameter is not that big.
Yeah, at least the diameter. I'm wondering in terms of the length, though. I think that's the thing for the hyper thing. But yeah, I guess we'll see how that goes.
Well, people build long, say, oil pipelines.
Yeah.
Which are,
that's a good point.
Which are 1,000 kilometers kind of lengths. So if there's a reason to do so, people know how to do it. Just there has to be a reason to do so.
Yeah, that makes sense. Gotcha. Well, cool. Looking at the time, I think we'll cut it there.
Yeah, happy to talk to you more.
Yeah, likewise. Well, thank you very much.
Sure.